Hi, I'm Cheryl Osteen, and today we're going to continue our exploration of membrane transport systems, and specifically we're going to be talking about active transport, which is when cells use energy to drag otherwise recalcitrant ions and molecules across the cell membrane. This active transport is key to most of the functioning of most living cells on the planet, so it's an important system. Before we look at it on the cellular level, we're going to go and look at a couple of whole organisms that use active transport in really weird ways, mainly because I just like weird organisms that do things that you don't expect them to do. And these certainly fill that category. This is the largest flower on the planet, and not only is it massively huge, but this spadix, this large structure up here, emits a scent to attract the pollinators, but this scent is a stink because these pollinators like things like rotten meat. And not only that, but the spadix contains tissue that is a heater. So it is heating that stink to waft it off into the environment. So, giant plant, stinky with a heater. The next oddball tissue we're going to look at is brown fat. Brown fat occurs in the infants of many mammals. It's also a heater. And as you can see from this thermal image of this baby, the red being hot and the white being even hotter, the brown fat is a tissue along the back which is keeping the core of that infant warm during the life stage when it couldn't otherwise thermoregulate for itself. Now, I wanted to bring up these two tissues because they use active transport in a really unusual way. And that's going to help us understand basic transport. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to basic transport, look at it at the cellular level, and then we're going to come back and consider these tissues, and I'm going to ask you to apply what you've learned to figure out how these tissues work. Okay, so back to basic transport. Previously we talked about passive transport. Passive transport operates when ions and molecules, which basically behave like antisocial people. So people who are antisocial, they're in a crowded room, they're going to try and get through a door into a less crowded room, and this is what ions and molecules will do. They will move down their concentration gradient if they have that opportunity. And membranes have ways to allow and even assist that passive transport. But more often, cells need ions and molecules to be in a certain place, often where they don't want to be. And for that, the cell needs to use energy to haul those ions and molecules where it wants them to go. And that's active transport. And we're going to start with primary active transport, which requires three things. First of all, it needs a pump that uses energy, which is often ATP. What it's doing with that pump, it's moving ions, that we just discussed, across the cell membrane. And the key element is that it's creating an electrochemical gradient. Electrochemical, from the sound of it you can tell, the electric part is that you're building up a charge on one side of the membrane. Typically it's positive outside, negative inside. And then chemical, you're having more of one kind of ion on one side than the other, creating those concentration gradients. All right, so let's look at an example of how this works. This is the sodium-potassium pump, which is a really common and important pump. The specific things that it does are to build a sodium gradient by moving sodium outside the cell. It builds a potassium gradient by moving potassium inside the cell. And together, those two things are going to build an overall electrical gradient, as we'll see. All right, how does it work? Well, the pump has these binding sites that are specially constructed to be attractive to the sodium ion. So the sodium goes in there, 3 of them bind, and then an ATP comes along, attaches to the pump. Now the phosphate of the ATP has some negative spots on it, and those negative spots interact with the pump and cause the pump to undergo these shape changes, as you can see here, and voila, it opens to the outside of the cell, and the shape change also basically ejects those sodium ions outside the cell. Now I wanted to show you these ribbon models of the sodium-potassium pump because the shape change is really important. And looking at these models that are based on what we really know about the structure of the pump, I can much more easily imagine that if the energy of an ATP comes along and interacts with this, that's going to cause this whole thing to shift in its structure and move that ion across the membrane. Okay, so we've ejected our sodium ions. Now this opens up some nice attractive binding sites specific for the potassium. The potassium binds. This causes that phosphate to now leave the pump, and that initiates a set of reversible changes in the shape of the pump. The potassium ions now are open to the cytoplasm, and they leave, and we're back to where we started from. Okay, so what have we accomplished here? Well, we've created that electrochemical gradient. We've now put the sodium on the outside, so we've got a concentration gradient there. We put the potassium on the inside, and we've built an electrical gradient where it's more positive outside the cell than inside. Now I'd like you to think a second about why. Why is it more positive outside than inside? And then I'd like you to write or diagram your answer on your study group handout, and I'll give you a minute to do that. And hey presto, your minute's up. Thank you. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to consider what the consequences are of that primary active transport. We created an electrochemical gradient. Well, what's that good for? Okay, the electrochemical gradient set up by the sodium-potassium pump, and this is just a different cartoon of that same sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump occurs in most cells in most animals, and that gradient that it creates is used for all kinds of energetic reactions. So secondary active transport differs from primary transport in two ways. First of all, it's using the energy of a gradient rather than ATP directly to energize its transport reactions. The second thing is it's usually moving a bigger molecule across the membrane. Okay, so secondary transport, secondary because first you have to build a gradient, and then the secondary transporter, which is called a co-transporter, is going to use the energy of that sodium gradient, the sodiums that want to go down inside the cell, and link that to transporting another molecule, in this case a glucose molecule, down along with that sodium into the cell. And there are many different kinds of co-transporters that all use that sodium gradient to move various things into the cell as well as out of the cell. All right. So now I want you to think about how these two things affect each other. Obviously, the co-transporter is reliant on the pump, but is the pump affected by the activity of the co-transporter? So get your clickers out and consider these possible interactions. And look at that, those responses are pouring in, so thank you. And now let's see what you came up with. And oh, great, okay, so most of you got the idea that if the co-transporter is working harder, it's degrading that sodium gradient that's so important, making the sodium-potassium pump work harder. All right, now let's go back to those weird organisms, that hot plant and that hot fat, and apply what you just learned about basic transport to try and figure out an unusual way to build a heater tissue. So this is the sodium-potassium pump co-transporter system that we've been looking at. This is not the system that those heater tissues actually use, but I want you to creatively try and design a way for this system to generate heat. Now, before you do that, I want you to think about one thing, which is what is the waste product of every energetic reaction that occurs? So if you drove your car in this morning, what happened to the heater? If you rode your bicycle up the hill to get to campus, what was the reaction?
Heat.
Heat, yes, thank you. Heat is a byproduct of every energetic reaction. So what you might be thinking about is how to crank up those energetic reactions of these pumps, or maybe make them spin their wheels in some way. And you've got at your disposal a million years of random mutations and natural selection, and I'd like you to creatively come up with a solution. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on that alone, then I'll have you discuss it with this person sitting next to you, and then we'll come back, look at the way the real systems do it, as well as consider the recent proposal that these high energy heat systems might solve our obesity epidemic. And because you guys are all so brilliant, I have a feeling that maybe one of the solutions you come up with might solve that, give us some insight into solving that problem. Thank you.